Hello, everybody. Welcome. Let's all take a moment to get settled in, and please go ahead and say hello in the chat and let us know where you are calling in from today. Hello to Jenny Lee, and we see Sue Kedgley. I see immediate past president Suzanne McNabb. Hi, Caitlin and Beryl. So welcome, everybody. We are here for the third installment of UN Women Aotearoa New Zealand's webinar series In Discussion With. And today we have the privilege to be speaking with an extraordinary group of panels of expert Ukrainian voices on the impact of women and girls in Ukraine. As everybody here on this call is well aware, the war in Ukraine has severely impacted everything from the social cohesion, community, security, and the resilience of our local communities, and especially amongst women and girls. It is estimated that 90% of the displaced are women and girls, having fled to neighboring countries such as Moldova, and others are displaced without and throughout the country. These numbers are only expected to increase significantly as the offensive continues. UN Women is providing direct support to women's civil society organizations, both in the Ukraine and in our neighboring countries, to ensure that they can continue their essential life-saving work. They're providing humanitarian support and basic services to their communities. And just to give an example, UN Women has repurposed existing resources to provide immediate support to over 2,000 women and children at the refugee accommodation centers, or RACs, in Moldova, and in close cooperation with relevant ministries and women organizations, with an additional 8,000 women and children expected to be reached in the coming weeks. UN Women has been working tirelessly with our partners to gather and analyze and disseminate data to illustrate the differential and disproportionate impacts of Russia's invasion on Ukraine women and girls. Over the last few months alone, we have produced at least 5 publications revealing the very grim reality of war and its evolution, particularly for the most vulnerable women and girls. The challenges are ever changing, requiring agility and adaptability. There's also a great deal of trauma, a lack of money and resources that is only exacerbating as each day passes, and of course, a huge sense of uncertainty. One day you think the place where you live has been liberated, and you wake the next morning to find the situation is different. The needs on the ground, which our panel will be discussing today, vary greatly. They vary by geography. You have active conflict areas where the needs are quite different. And in other parts of the country, you are addressing the needs of internally displaced women and children who have fled their home. They require access to services, many of which are limited. A number of hospitals have been destroyed. Women are seeking employment and qualifications to support their families day by day in these displaced circumstances. The needs also vary by age. Children are at home. Some are lucky enough to be attending school remotely. There are elderly who are not mobile, and clearly there are very severe health and mental well-being, of which is the most important. This lack of access to social services, including schools and strained community resources, have increased the care burden of local women who are generally responsible for the care of children and the elderly. And the needs also vary by vulnerable populations and those with specific unique needs. Women with disabilities, with chronic illnesses, who have life-dependent needs for the continuation of access to medication. UN Women has been helping to procure wheelchairs, for example, for elderly mothers and the disabled who have been left at bus stops and dropped off at camps and are not able to be moved. We are working with our partners who specialize in health, housing, water, to help them to be aware of the specific needs of women of all ages and all ability to make sure that their needs are properly addressed. To start today's panel, I'm very keen to introduce, we have Golriz Ghahraman, who is here, and she is a phenomenal MP with the Green Party, and she has come to us as an Oxford-educated lawyer, both here in Aotearoa and overseas, focusing on enforcing human rights and government's accountability. Golriz's work has included restoring communities after war and human rights atrocities, with an emphasis on empowering women engaged in peace and justice initiatives. As an Iranian Kiwi refugee, Golriz has made history as the first ever refugee to be sworn in and as a member of parliament in New Zealand after arriving in Aotearoa as a child asylum seeker with her family from Iran. Today, as a New Zealand member of parliament, she has successfully advocated on human rights issues before the Supreme Court. Before entering parliament, Golriz was active in the NGO community, volunteering her many skills to advance justice reform, refugee and migrant rights, and for family carers and disabled persons. Golriz, thank you so much for being here with us today. It is an honor to speak with you and to hear your unique and informed perspective on the situation in Ukraine, both currently and the needs as they will continue to emerge as the crisis unfolds.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So Golriz,
we were going to introduce the others.
Jump right in. The floor is yours, please, and we're very keen to hear your perspective and perhaps some of the things that we, as the community here in New Zealand, can do to help support the situation in Ukraine, especially coming, like I said, from your very unique perspective.
Yeah, so I think, you know, when I come to portfolios like defense and foreign affairs, and which this falls into in terms of my professional life, it can't help but bring that lived experience. And in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, I just think it's important for us to kind of stop and feel that kind of human sense of loss and anxiety and terror, which is being felt every moment over there. And I do remember that as a child in Iran, living with the bombardments as we, for most of my childhood, before we left, lived under war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So the oppression was there, but the war was the backdrop to it. And I think as we all heard the stories of Ukrainians going underground to safety and sleeping in basements and in the underground train facilities, it really brought all of that back. So anyone who's lived through a war will know the kind of silent terror of waiting for bombs, and there's not a lot of noise and screaming. It's just that kind of silence and the tension. So I just want to hold that for us all because it's happening right now. I guess the next thing for me is that work in kind of post-atrocity justice contexts. And one of the things that, and for me, that was in the criminal justice context and in UN courts that would hold the likes of Putin and his generals to account. But one of the things that kind of stood out for me was that as we congratulated ourselves in these justice institutions for including women's issues, as you know, some of the first trials happened in the Yugoslavia and the Rwanda tribunals where, for example, sexual violence, rape was tried as a crime under genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity, but was recognized as a freestanding crime. It felt a little bit like those are wins. So we're recognizing that in war, when atrocities happen, women are particularly vulnerable in a very particular way. But we weren't necessarily as good at mainstreaming women into what we looked at as being the whole of the atrocity. So as you've mentioned, you know, women having to escape a war have particular vulnerabilities, even without gender-based violence. So we have the care of children. We have the care of the elderly. Women are less likely to be financially independent, for example, especially women with young kids. So we have all of these other levels where in justice institutions, that meant, you know, are we selecting witnesses that are coming along and giving that testimony as women? You know, what was it like when these cities were being evacuated, and is that being captured? But now is an opportunity to actually address those needs as they happen. So my approach to it, as we kind of look at what New Zealand is contributing, is to say, it's good that we're supporting NATO, that's fine. It's good that we're giving some military aid. But is that, does that aid need to be monetary? Does it need to be by way of a militarized type of approach? You know, sure, we can supply personnel that as we have in London to train, but does that need to be in a military context? Because actually the humanitarian need is far greater. And are we not better off connecting more meaningfully with who is on the ground, who is delivering this aid, and asking those questions, as others might not be, about whether certain communities are being included? And when I come at this in terms of a women's issue, I think it's really important to hold that there are also gender minorities and the rainbow community who are also displaced with very specific needs, and in particular, if they are in areas that are now under Russian control, that they'll be feeling particularly vulnerable, because we know the treatment of gender minorities and other members of the rainbow community is very harsh under Putin's rule in Russia. So what's happening in Ukraine, and how are those needs being met? Are there NGOs on the ground who've been doing that work, supporting those communities, who are connected with them, who we can support? And that includes in terms of the work with women. So are there NGOs or community-based organizations who've been meeting the needs of Ukrainian women in terms of gender-based violence, sexual violence, who will be better placed to provide that support moving forward? Have they moved to the border? Do they have aid corridors open to them? And so I'm not sure we've kind of started to mainstream, I guess, women's issues and the issues of the rainbow community into our humanitarian aid response, whether that's planning, whether that's connecting, whether it's setting aside an actual budget. And part of that problem, I fear, for us in New Zealand, is that we never really abided by our commitment to mainstreaming women in peace and security outcomes or policy delivery here within our own institutions. So, you know, asking the question about one of my favorite, I don't know if everyone else has favorite Security Council resolutions, but as a nerd, 1325, which is on women in peace and security. And we're supposed to report annually, and we almost always kind of fail. So who is actually designing our defense and humanitarian aid response here? Does it include women? Does it include women who've worked in gender issues? And are we then seeing that reflected in our aid? So those are the questions that I'm asking, I guess, as a lawmaker, but from that perspective of, I know that after this atrocity is over, we will be capturing women's experiences, and they will be very different than those of a status quo male experience. And of course, in Ukraine, that's even more stark than in most other war zones, because we literally have a border that's open just for women. We have the displaced community of elderly and women and children versus men who are having another horrific experience, but it's very, very different. So I think sort of the safe countries that are providing aid need to ask ourselves questions about who we're including in the decision-making, design and delivery of the aid response here. And it needs to be women, and it needs to be gender minorities.
Wonderful. Golriz, I could not agree more with you that inclusion of the totality of women is of the utmost importance. And this is, we'll speak to this a little bit later in the panel, but this is absolutely a priority of UN Women and a key part of the work that UN Women has been doing in the Ukraine. So we'll come back to you for some thoughts on that. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Professor Natalia Chaban. Professor Natalia Chaban is originally from the Ukraine, and she has come to New Zealand in 2002. She is coming to us today from the University of Canterbury Department of Media and Communication, where she focuses on the interdisciplinary research on cognitive and semiotic aspects of political and media discourses, image and perception studies within the EU and IR contexts, and public diplomacy and political communication. She is twice awarded the Jean Monnet Chair, Director of Public Diplomacy and Political Communication Forum at UC, President of Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand, and the co-editor of the peer-reviewed Australia and New Zealand Journal of European Studies. Of a number of Commission and NATO. Professor Chaban, thank you so much for being here with us today. We are very eager to hear your academic research, your academic perspective, your personal perspective on the situation in Ukraine. And we just want to acknowledge how close to home this topic is for you. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Kia ora kouti, everyone. Buonasera today from Italy, and dobre ranok for everybody in New Zealand. Thank you very much, Tara, for your very kind invitation and for your kind introduction. And I hope to add to our today's discussion with several other questions. There was an excellent moment in the previous presentation about capturing women's experiences. So the questions I ask are, how do we know about women and girls in Ukraine? Who has the voice? Who is told about? I'm a political communicator. As a political communicator, I want to analyze and I want to talk today about women narrators, women who have a voice and tell the story, their experiences from Ukraine, but also how women in Ukraine are narrated and how we know about them in the world. I'm currently in Italy at the conference, and I have to tell you that this conference and the conference dedicated to the European Union, the main theme is Ukraine. Everybody talks about the war in Ukraine. The news about the war are on all the channels. I was in Germany before. Ukrainian flags are everywhere. And Ukraine is the main theme in everyday conversations in cafes and the shops, not only in academic rooms. And part of the story is due to the many Ukrainian women and children who are on the ground in Europe. And they are being helped. There is a lot of help, a lot of solidarity, but also there is lots of uncertainty for these women. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about who are the narrators. Do we have women who are from Ukraine who are sending messages from the grounds on Ukraine? And if you look at the Ukraine strategic communication during the war, it's actually quite an interesting phenomenon. What we see is a distinct visibility of Ukraine. Even if you think about New Zealand, Ukraine wasn't such a top news for decades. There was a little bit of a spike of interest about in Ukraine after 2014, after Euromaidan, after the annexation of Crimea, after the start of war in Donbass. But then there was silence. For 8 years, we didn't hear much in New Zealand about what was going on in the east of Ukraine, occasionally, but not, of course, in great volume. Now we obviously get a lot of information. So if we look how Ukraine is communicated, everybody talks about Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, virtual diplomacy around the world, how he addresses parliaments around the world, presents to people. He just recently spoke at Cannes Festival. He has very powerful social media profiles. He's not the only who is communicating. We have a team of professional communicators with him, Mikhailo Podolyak, who is the head of the negotiation team, Alexei Arestovich, who comes every day on YouTube for a 40-minute conversation with Mark Fagin to analyze yet another day of war. the Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs Kuleba, and there is also a number of other social media commentators, Cymbaluk, Berezovets, Zhdanov. But what is striking, they're all men. If you look at the negotiation team around the table, on both sides of the table, they are all men. So my question is, where do we have official voices? Is there any strong official female voices coming from Ukraine? And we have quite a powerful figure, Irina Venediktova, who is Ukraine's prosecutor general. And you can only imagine her portfolio. She's investigating suspected war crimes committed by the Russian government and military. She's regularly appearing in international media. She's one of very active social commentators. But again, you can only imagine the moral, how heavy it is, emotionally heavy this portfolio is. Who are the female narrators, or what we call influencers, who do appear from Ukrainian side? Olena Zelenska, she is wife, she's first lady of Ukraine, she's wife of Volodymyr Zelensky. But also we should remember that she is a professional woman, she's an architect, she's also a screenwriter. She was one of the co-founder of Kvartal 95, a highly successful entertainment show where her husband was performing. She is one of the writers of the text. So she's professional, smart, she understands very well the importance of communication. Again, somebody was very active social media profile, lots of interviews with international media, but also meeting with lots of dignitaries and profiling Ukraine in a much more sort of emotional theme connected to the theme of, yes, women and children. So she definitely covers these themes in her communications. But I probably would also like to mention two influencers who are actually are entertainers in their past, Masha Yefrosinian and Olga Polyakova. They were always in a light genre, sort of pop music, celebrities, and the war changed them. They became highly emotional commentators. And in the first days of war, sort of very raw emotions which came from them. And then you look at official male communicators, they never do this, they never go that way. But this type of communication definitely comes from these particular people. And Masha and Olga Polyakova currently are outside of Ukraine, and they continue their very active social media dialogues. It's very interesting to look at the comments, and very often people are commenting, oh, you're not wearing makeup, oh, you look, and then they are commenting, how dare you to comment about my appearances when there's something terrible happening. And it's to see all the gender stereotypes happening in the flows of communication around the war, and how certain things just, the war changed many things, and certain standards which we used to apply are not working anymore. I probably would like to mention several female commentators, several voices which are coming from actually the Russian Federation. These are Russian dissident narrators, journalists who had to move outside of Russia and who become very critical voices when it comes to covering the war in Ukraine. Yulia Latynina, who is a journalist and author from the most popular program, The Ikar of Moscow, who is very active and appears almost every day on social media, interviewing Ukrainian policymakers, Ukrainian political actors. Ekaterina Gordeeva, who is also a documentary writer and an author, also outside of the Russian Federation, who has these very long 2-hour interviews, but she looks into the moral questions. How will you live the Russian Federation after the war or during the war? What can you change? Where is your consciousness? Ekaterina Shulman, political scientist from Russia who had to go to Germany. Maria Pevchi, who is investigative journalist, activist, and head of the investigative unit of the Olha Anti-Corruption Foundation. Probably you know her from her reportage about Putin's palace. And very quickly, I want to say that this is the narrators, but what is narrated and what we hear a lot and what we see a lot in media is the stories about female victims of war or female refugees with children. And these are very often frames of women who are in need, women who need to be sort of helped and saved. And they tend to dominate. what I would like to say that there are other female figures, and very often they are not in the center of media frame. Female soldiers, for example, or activists who are around the world trying to help, to collect money, to do something. But it's interesting how they are not in the center of the frame. And finally, many of these female portrayals are still focusing on younger women, while one of the forgotten theme of this war is actually older women. In Ukraine, women tend to live longer than men, and there are lots of older single women who've been impacted by the war heavily, but they're not in the middle of the media story. They're not told about, not their health problems, not the fact that they're single older women who have to fight for their lives. And you shouldn't also forget that many of these women are still working women, and potentially one of the questions is about what does it mean for them to be without work, to be without job. And I'll finish with the personal story. My parents, they left Ukraine. They started moving out of Ukraine on day 3 of the war. And my mom, who all her life worked and is a vice principal at school, a teacher who got awards from the government of Ukraine, now is not working. She's safe, but I know that for her it's very, very difficult not to be able to work, because that's part of her identity, and it's something we all have to deal with as a family. I'll keep you updated, but thank you for the invitation, and I hope my perspective from political communication angle was a contribution into discussion to discuss later. Thank you.
Professor Chaban, thank you so much, and your contribution is greatly appreciated. And there's a few questions I know that we'll probably be able to answer towards the end. I'd like to encourage all of our participants today to put any questions that you have in the Q&A or in the chat. We have a couple of questions that have been pre-submitted. Hopefully we'll have time for some that are coming in live. So please do put those in, because we would really love to hear from you. Our next esteemed panelist is Natalia Gibbert, and she is a cultural scientist by education and a translator by profession. She is the co-founder of the foundation Warsaw Initiative Open House, and since 2015 she has been working socially with refugees and spreading knowledge about migration. In 2018, she received the award of the capital city of Warsaw for her social activities. Unfortunately, she was unable to be with us at the very last minute, but she did send a short recording to share with us today. That recording was conducted by Izabela Gładkowska, who is with us today, and she is happy to take any questions on behalf of Natalia. Izabela was born in Poland and has both Ukrainian and Polish ancestors. She just returned from 2 months in Poland and is involved with several charities and NGOs, both in Poland and in New Zealand, including New Zealand Red Cross as the International Relations Coordinator at a Better School Foundation in Poland, which helps to initiate and support innovative solutions in education. She is also the founder of My Polish Roots Facebook page, and she works as a research scientist. Thank you, Izabela, for being here with us today and willing to field the questions on behalf of Ms. Gebert. And so we'll launch a short video message from Ms. Gebert now. I think we're having some sort of technical difficulties because it doesn't seem like there's any sound. So we'll give it just one more moment. And then
we're talking a few thousand, maybe 1,000 people a year. The only exception being the time of the war in Chechnya, the numbers were high. And now all of a sudden, you have 3 million people crossing the border, fleeing the border. It was an incredible challenge, nearly logistical. Of course, the border crossing so long that it would take a day or two to actually cross the border. The initial response was quite well organized. I have to grant the authorities that. Once you cross the border, you could take a bus to one of the reception centers where you could rest, with food, could take a shower, basically catch up and figure out what you're going to do next from there. Major part of the response to the Ukrainian situation was on the part of the civic society. Individual people, just put their lives on the hang for a while and rush to the border or reception centers to help, to deliver food, deliver information, direct people which train to take, help entertain kids, and a whole host of other services. What is amazing, and I don't think it's been practiced on this scale ever before, is that a lot of individual people just took Ukrainian families into their homes. Many families found their new home with the hosting families. So it's incredible on social level.
A majority of the Ukrainian refugees which cross the Polish borders are mainly women and children. We know that around 140,000 children already joined the Polish schools, and I know that your organization also is working on some initiative within the education. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Of course. Basically, the education is a challenge, again, because of the scale. But not only. It's also a challenge because Polish school has not been prepared to work with children with migration experience. Those who happened to be enrolled in Polish school before the war, migrant children, refugee children, were few in between. So they were like, an odd case than a real methodological challenge. And now you have thousands of new students, and you have to figure out how to work. But you also have tens of thousands of Ukrainian kids who study online on the Ukrainian curriculum. And since they don't go to school, they are sort of naturally cut off from other from socialization in general. Right, it's in school when you meet new kids, right, make friends, decide to go somewhere, I don't know, play football, and so on and so on. So this is a gap that needs taken care of. And this has partly happened. There's been a number of community centers being created for Ukrainian children and Polish children as well, because the idea is not to have Ukrainians integrate with themselves. Rather, the idea is that the Ukrainian kids could socialize with Polish kids. We have the plan for the summer. We are getting ready for autumn when more children like to enroll, because right now a lot of parents are convinced that this one is going to be soon to be over soon, and we'll be going back home. And by September, they will probably change their mind. So they would decide to enroll kids in school, and September is when the school year starts. And yes, a new influx of Ukrainian students. But we also need to think long term.
Exactly.
Absolutely. This is severely missing.
Tell us, in the long run, how the international organizations like UN Women New Zealand can help.
Well, you can, first of all, you can advocate for long-term planning. That's already something. because right now no one seems to be looking that far, including international NGOs. They work on midterm horizon. You could, of course, help with raising funds, because again, right now funds are available in a half a year or even less, when the grants end, and there is no long-term response in place by then. It may turn out that lots of efforts and services and initiatives that were started would have simply to close down because of lack of funds. Which is one of the reasons I haven't opened my community center for refugee kids just yet. I just can't imagine, running it for a year and then telling kids, or half a year, and then telling kids, sorry, money ran out, I have to close. And of course, no one knows how long the war will take and when it's going to end. But even if the war ends, it doesn't mean all refugees go back. Some of them will get used to living in Poland, right, and decide to stay here after all. Some have nothing to return to. Their house being destroyed. Ukraine's economy is suffering and is going to suffer more. So after the war, we'll rather see more Ukrainian people coming in search of jobs. We need to plan long term, whatever that long term might be. But we need to have, scenarios, potential solutions, options to consider and potentially implement when it actually happens.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for that wonderful talk. And please keep up the good work. And we wish you all the best and have a great day.
Have a great day yourself. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natalia and Dr. Isabella, for helping to lead that conversation. Our next speaker is Olga Viazenko. And Olga Viazenko is a Ukrainian activist organizing peaceful protests and fundraisers to help support Ukrainians here in New Zealand and overseas. Kiev-born Ukrainian herself, Olga now lives in Dunedin, New Zealand, with her husband and daughter for the past 3.5 years. Both a lawyer and an investigative journalist, Olga has great knowledge of Ukraine and is currently studying applied management at Otago Polytechnic, as well as working in event organization. Olga's mother and father-in-law are currently fleeing from the war in Ukraine to Poland with other family members that are still in Ukraine. Olga, thank you so much for being here today and agreeing to share your personal stories of what is going on the front lines of this crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, a little bit detail. So I already graduated and relocated to Dunedin from Auckland to work, and my mother and mother-in-law. So we have more women in our family, and yeah, so they are both together and they are both in Poland waiting for their visas. We want to bring them here because they have nobody except us. So yeah, they will be in, I hope they will be in Poland and we will get our visas soon. I would like to support all previous sorts of our speakers, and yeah, I want to add a little bit of statistic and role of women in Ukrainian society now, and challenges they are facing now and their choices. So first of all, I want to say that anything the woman choose is respectful and amazing. Whether the woman decided to stay or to leave Ukraine or to fight or to volunteer, so nobody can judge her, and or even just try to leave and as nothing happening. So it's her choice and it is respectful, and nobody can judge her for her choice. This is really important because women, for example, that women who are fleeing from Ukraine abroad, they are facing judgment as, oh, you you left your country, you have to stay in your country. Women who stayed in country, who decided not to leave Ukraine, facing judgments such as you have to save yourself and your children, you do not have to stay in Ukraine. So it's also the moral problem now in Ukraine. Also, Natalia made a great point about the voices of women, and unofficially, women in Ukraine has really strong influence, but officially they still facing this inequality. And even now, the role of women in society is growing rapidly. A lot of men lost their jobs and joined military forces. At the same time, women are taking all new roles for them that previously men did. So they take more working hours, they raise children, they teach children, they care about elders, or sick relatives. Often they volunteering, helping army or refugees after their job and home duties. So it's a lot of women's shoulders now in Ukraine and abroad, of course. So they have to take all heavy duties from men who choose to go to the army or who had to go to the army. Since 2014, from the beginning of the war, not now, but the war in Ukraine is more than 8 years. The role of women in Ukrainian army grown significantly, and they obtain a lot of roles that were unable for them in the past. Over 37,000 women serve in Ukrainian army, and they are fighting with dignity and fighting as equals. And there are also a lot of problems. For example, men, even if they are not in army, they are not available to go abroad. And that women who are serving in army, they need to care somehow about their children. And I know personal stories when the children of such kind of women were abroad and they even couldn't meet with their father because the father is not available to. He cannot go abroad, and with mother because mother is serving in the army. So it's one more problem for women who are putting a lot on their shoulders. A lot of journalists are women, and they are also working on the front line as men, so along with them, and under the same risk to be killed or wounded. The role of Ukrainian women abroad is also really significant. They organize protests, fundraise, beg for fundraising, hosting refugees, taking the significant part in initiatives and projects, and all of that after their job and household care about their relatives or whatever. So it's also the big part of work for women. For that, people who decided to stay, I want to add firstly that over 400 official civilians have been killed in Ukraine, and at least 4,000 and at least 1,000 from them are women and 100 girls. And this is only we know officially, because for such cities as Mariupol, the mayor of Mariupol reported that more than 20,000 people were killed, and that is the amount they know about that, but nobody will know truth because a lot of bodies were just burned to hide these crimes. So women also facing murdering. Yeah. Over 14 million people have been forced to flee from their home, but I'm sure that it's more people who had to leave their home and move somewhere to the villages, to the other regions of Ukraine or abroad. Now it is 5 million Ukrainians, and 90% of them are women and children are abroad. So part of these 8 millions, it was 8 millions from the beginning, but nearly 3 millions came back to Ukraine, so 5 million still abroad. For those women who decided to stay in Ukrainian cities in the active war zone, and nobody knows what zone will be active in the next few days, for example. So this sexual crime is one of the biggest risks. Women and children are the most vulnerable population, and officially it is 124 registered rapes, but of course it is much more such kind of crimes. And most of these women, and the women over 60 among them, have either both executed after the crime or of rape, or they have taken their own lives. So, and this is only that crimes that were reported. We have much more bigger numbers, thousands of such kind of crimes. And the main problem is that victims and families do not have the strength and capacity to come forward and to speak about that. The sexual violence is the most hidden crime. And for every girl and woman who is willing to tell her story, there are many others who will be silent for years and who will never speak about that. And I even do not know how to help these people. And yeah, so we need to work with psychologists, and this amount of that psychologists who can work with trauma should be huge. It's not just a couple of people. So it's a great problem for Ukraine. It would be, and it would be in future. The Russian Federation is using sexual violence and rapes and as instruments of terror and control civilians. And there are numerous allegations of sexual crimes committed by Russian troops with the bodies of those tortured or raped burned to hide their evidence, especially in such kind of cities as Mariupol or Kherson or other cities which are under Russian control. So they are now hiding their crimes as soon as they can. So nobody has evidence. Also, some 1 million Ukrainians, most women and children, were have been forcibly removed to Russian Federation and are being forced to take their Russian citizenship against their will, and they do not have ability to come back to Ukraine. And of course, their children are separated from their mothers, and the mothers were sent to the different part of Russia, and nobody knows what is the destiny of that people who are there. Yeah, another problem is transgender people who fill in as women, but they are still in passports, they're still men, and they cannot leave Ukraine, or they have to serve in army, but they feel as women. I think it's another topic, but it's also very important to support that people and to send them as much support as we can. Yeah, so this is a little bit, and I have a lot of personal stories. As you know, I was a journalist, and I traveled a lot everywhere in Ukraine, and I have a lot of friends, and it's hard to hear their stories. It's hard to hear about their losses, about their struggling, about judgment around them. So yeah, it's still a lot of problems for women being in Ukraine and abroad as well.
Olga, thank you so much. I think that you've touched on a couple of very crucial topics here that I'm hoping that we might be able to delve into in the question and answer portion now of our discussion. And you know, within the UN humanitarian nexus, UN Women has become an influencer and an advocate for women and girls. And we are working very closely with civil society organizations, our development partners, and the Ukrainian and even Moldova governments. UN Women has produced what is called the Rapid Gender Analysis Assessment. And this is a very thorough list of data that is crucial because, as we all know, without data, we are unable to inform ourselves and, more importantly, help drive the decisions, not only of large humanitarian organizations, but also of major donors. So as UN Women is a continuing reminder of the needs that women have, the very specific needs. Olga, you talked about transgender people and the support that they need, and also the various judgment. I know Professor Chaban, you talked about capturing women's experiences and who are sharing these narratives. And Golriz, you mentioned that because women have these particular vulnerabilities, and specifically your background around advocating for disabled persons, my question to the panel is, how can we give women and girls a stronger voice in this situation? And this goes very nicely, Jenny Leaf has put in the chat, is there a role for women in peace and the voice that they have in negotiations? So if you don't mind opening up, just giving a raise, and we'll call on you with your raised hand. Go ahead, Golriz, please.
I was just going to say, because that question is of particular significance to me, and that is, that Security Council resolution on peace and security and inclusion of women that we as New Zealand have signed on to, that we're supposed to be reporting on, that I touched on, and we kind of don't really. But I think that is really key, where and others have spoken about this as well, where it's sort of whose voices, whose official or unofficial narratives are being centered. So to my mind, I think as the New Zealand government, we have an obligation to include women aid experts and security experts and defense experts in the group who design and deliver our humanitarian aid responses in Ukraine, but with an eye to also advocating for women in Ukraine to be partnered with in terms of who is then designing and delivering that aid on the ground. And in terms of the peace negotiations, I think New Zealand has a really important role as an independent principled voice on the international stage to engage really meaningfully with peace mediation. We're not necessarily on one or the other side, other than to say Russia is the aggressor in this war, but we're not, involved in a Cold War backdrop as such. So we can actually mediate for peace, but that has to mean that we lead by prioritizing the voices of women, the voices of other marginalized groups, and ensuring that we're actually doing that by supporting Ukrainians to be engaged at that level. And as others have said, Ukrainian women are experts. They're not just victim witnesses. They're experts, they're lawyers, they're judges, they can define what a war crime is as well as anyone else. They can define what peace can look like, what measures in terms of mental health services Ukrainian women and others will need. These are experts, not just the victim population. So I think as New Zealanders who are engaging with this war and humanitarian aid delivery, we have a responsibility to call for women and other marginalized groups to be at the decision-making table at every level, not just peace negotiations, but definitely peace negotiations, but in terms of the design and delivery of every response. Otherwise, the response won't be fit for purpose.
Golriz, that was a beautiful response, and I think everybody here feels exactly the same way that you do, especially our voice here in New Zealand and how it can affect the voices and amplify the voices of our sisters around the world. Professor Chaban, would you like to chime in here, please?
I just want to say that I very much second what Golriz has just said about the fact that it should be equal partnership. I think it's wonderful when people are helping, but being talked at might not be that appreciated. It's actually about joint leadership. And I just want to stress that there are so many professional Ukrainian women in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine who have skills, expertise, and networks who will be actually good in in pointing where is the most effective and efficient way to connect and help, because they know better. And here in Europe, one of my arguments was at the conference here was that there's so many refugees here in Europe at the moment. We know 4.8 million. They're not only female refugees, but nevertheless, so 4.8 million people in Europe. They should be seen as 4.8 million resources, because these are people with, again, profession, knowledge, experiences, not just a burden on the society, not just people who need to be helped, but people who can link the societies who host them, who try to help them, to Ukraine, to the rebuild of Ukraine. And it's that agency which I want to stress. It's that fact that it should be joint leadership in whatever capacity. But again, we have to be careful. This is a traumatized society, and some things which we may see in one light just because our experiences are different, we have to be very mindful of that. So that's my point.
Very, very good point about the reframing of resources and how important that is, to also look at survivors and individuals who are victims of the situation in an empowered sense, so that their voice is heard in that light. Olga, would you like to wrap up this question and then we'll move on?
Yeah, I want to add one cultural feature of Ukrainian women, that it's really important to have the voice of women, because in Ukraine, women never will ask for help. So it's not a habit to ask for help. Women will suffer, women will do whatever they can, but they will never ask for help, and they will never speak about their issues, their problems, etc. For example, even raping, most of them will think that it is their guilty. So they're guilty that they were raped. And this is the problem as well. That's why we need these voices of women who will communicate with their society, with women in Ukraine, and can help and support them. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have time for one or two more questions, but I'll pose this one and then I'd like to see if we can get to the chat before we wrap up. So representatives of UN Women in Ukraine and Moldova offices have been continuously stressing that without economic opportunities, there is no security for women, even in time of war, and especially in time of war. Income and livelihood are paramount, and you have women who have been displaced, many of them left their homes with a small bag and their children, and they are skilled and they have a lot to offer. They are assets to society, and yet they are struggling. Can you speak to the importance of this? I know, Professor Chaban, you mentioned highlighting single older women who are very skilled and who are not getting the attention in the media. What does it mean for a whole society of women to be out of work, a skilled society? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Just a very quick comment about that. For example, everybody who is a state employee, so the one who is a state employee, if they're outside of Ukraine, they have to go back, or otherwise they will be fired. So many of them are actually older women who have that institutional knowledge, that know how things work, and they sort of left the country, and the country needs them now. I've heard some, I don't want to lie, but there's some dozens of thousands teachers left Ukraine, and many of them, again, they are female teachers, older female teachers who left. So the deficit of these professional women is already felt. That so the state structures need them, the schools need them, and it's something we should sort of we should keep in mind. I just wanted to speak about academia. That's the field I know the best, and I want to tell you that specifically on academic front, we have a lot of support to the female academics who left, and at the moment I'm observing universities in Europe, because I'm in Europe for the research trip, who are very, very generous and helping Sometimes I've just met a Ukrainian most talented young woman with 4 children. Her youngest is 6 months, and she left. Her husband is back to Ukraine, and so she's an academic. She tries to write her articles. She takes care of 4 children, but she's in Germany, and Germany as a state has a very generous support. So every state has sort of a different program how to help. And New Zealand has been very generous with the special Ukrainian refugee, special Ukrainian visa. I know I can speak about the University of Canterbury, where we've been in dialogue, academics of Ukrainian origin, we've been in dialogue with our leaders, management at SMT team, and they're very supportive. It's just, I think there is a lot of goodwill in New Zealand and around the world. And I very much agree with Olga, who says that sometimes Ukrainian women like, I'll do it myself. I don't need to ask anyone for help. I don't want to burden other people. That's sort of a mentality I can overcome. But it's all about information. When there is information, where to look for help, who to ask. I personally connected a number of my female colleagues, academics, with my European colleagues who have all these generous schemes to help. And they're like, but nobody's asking. It's because they don't know where to look. And that's another problem. So it's that information is a resource itself.
Wonderful. Golriz, would you like to chime in here? And I just want to mention that we are 2 minutes over time, and I would like to continue finishing this dialogue because it is very important. So for all the participants, I thank you for your patience and for extending the time. We understand if you do have to step out, but for those of you who are able to stay, it would be lovely to hear from Golriz and Olga. Go ahead.
I was just going to say very briefly, I put this to the EU ambassador about their resettlement support for Ukrainians, because as we've just heard, the different countries where refugees are going to have very different capacities and responses, and there does need to be a resettlement support program. And I think this is a bit of a problem with New Zealand as well. It's very generous and very well deserved for us to say that 4,000 Ukrainians who are family members of Ukrainian New Zealanders can come here. That's great. But because it's a temporary visa, it doesn't have that wraparound resettlement support that a refugee program would have. And the resettlement support that refugees get is very much about information. So you come in as a supported person who gets told how to access different services and different things here. So I'm keeping an eye on this, and I'm not sure why people fleeing war have been only given a temporary visa rather than that option of resettlement. I know that people want to go back, and that's the hope for everyone who flees war. But that should be a choice rather than something where we give fewer resources and less information and less wraparound support, because the hope is that they will go back. So those are two concerns that I'm sort of keeping an eye on and asking those questions. But I think the generosity of the public has been kind of taking care of some of that stuff. It shouldn't be that governments abscond our responsibility, though.
Thank you, Golriz. Olga, would you like to wrap up this question?
Yeah. I want to add a little bit about this special Ukrainian visa, and probably the government can help us with that. So this visa is quite limited. We will never have 4,000 Ukrainians with this visa. So it's only for residents, and families have to pay for everything. Ukrainians are not refugee, and not everybody can afford to bring here relatives. For example, for my family, we have to bring here 2 our moms, they're 70 plus, and 2 children of my husband. We want to bring all of them. So we will have 4 members in our family who will not be able to work. And we have to support them, and we have to pay to rent a house or whatever. But we are not able to bring them here because we are not residents, and we are waiting for our residency, and we do not know when we will get it. So it's a great problem, but it's only our family, and we have nearly 2,000 Ukrainians in New Zealand, and among them a lot of Ukrainians are quite long living in New Zealand, and they already moved their relatives here. And for that part who really need that, they are on visas and they cannot use this special Ukrainian visa, or because of different reasons, or they do not have money, or they do not have opportunity to bring their relatives because they are on wrong visas. So it will never be 4,000 Ukrainians, and most of people who will come here, it would be women after 60 with or siblings, sisters with children. So it would not be men. And the problem with job is that it's a lot of job in construction or physical job, but for these women, especially without English knowledge, they really do not know what to do. So it's another problem for that people who will, for Ukrainians who will come here to New Zealand. Yeah, this was my point about visas.
I wanted to just say a very big thank you to all of our panelists today. Your perspectives have been illuminating, and thank you so much for taking the time to share them, to bring us a little bit more of in-depth awareness of what the most serious issues are. I also want to thank those of you as participants who have generously donated to the Ukrainian Emergency Appeal for UN Women. As you can see, the work that UN Women is doing would not be possible without you, and the work that UN Women is doing on the ground in the Ukraine is incredibly important. We are receiving direct reports from both Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova that not only does the fund that have been raised bring crucial support to our civil society partners that we are supporting directly and helping to give a voice to, but almost equally as important, we are bringing a huge amount of solidarity, and the energy and the support is felt deeply on the ground by the women and those civil society groups that are working tirelessly to be able to provide support and services. At UN Women New Zealand, we often talk about standing with our sisters around the globe. And I will say that Kiwi women especially understand the importance of a united front and the power and the hope that that brings. As women continue to bear the different and additional burdens, some of which we've discussed today, of war, it is crucial that all women are represented in decision-making platforms and the pursuit of peace and security for the people, not only of Ukraine and beyond. So I urge each one of you today to become a member of UN Women Aotearoa New Zealand and to help stand in solidarity with our Ukrainian sisters to continue to help UN Women make the world a brighter and better place for women and girls the world over. You matter, your contribution matters, your voice, compassion, and your action all make a difference. Again, a very warm thank you to our partners, our empowerment partners, ANZ and Trilogy, our advocacy partners, Women Leaders Institute, Everblue, Dunedin Ventures. If you are representing a company that would like to help support the good work that is being done here today, please don't hesitate to reach out. The work that is being done is not possible without you. Again, a warm thank you to our panelists, and thank you so much for joining us for the third installment of UN Women Aotearoa New Zealand in discussion with. Everybody have a wonderful day.